They came with contracts, not weapons. That was the part nobody warned us about. The Veth arrived in low orbit on a Tuesday morning in March, their ships hanging over the major cities like coins balanced on their edges. Thin, silent, catching the light in ways that made your eyes water. No weapons fire. No demands broadcast on every frequency. Just a transmission in 37 languages that said, in effect, "We have something you want." And they were right. They called it the frame. The full technical designation was something in Veth phonetics that no human larynx could approximate. A cascade of resonant clicks and held tones that sounded, to the untrained ear, like water running over loose gravel. The translation software settled on frame and it stuck. The frame was a biomechanical body, not a suit, not a prosthetic. A complete, living chassis grown from engineered tissue and laced with a substrate of synthetic nerve fiber so dense and responsive that it registered sensation down to the pressure of a fingernail. You put your memory card in the slot at the base of the skull, and you woke up in a new body as fully as you had ever woken up in your own. The Veth had been doing this for 200 years. They explained through their translators, outgrown the biological body entirely. The frame was better in every measurable way. Stronger, faster. It did not age, did not succumb to cancer or infection, did not tire the way flesh tired. You could update it, upgrade it, modify its appearance the way you change clothes. The only limitation was money. Frames were expensive to grow, expensive to maintain, and you paid a recurring lease because the Veth still held the patent and the proprietary substrate and 14 other layers of intellectual property that their legal apparatus had been refining for decades. What they were offering humanity was not a gift. It was a subscription. The line outside the first Veth Corps licensing office in Paris stretched for 11 blocks on opening day. Corporal Dara Osi had not stood in that line. She had not stood in any line. She had watched the whole thing unfold from a cot in a VA recovery ward in Lyon, where she was working through the third week of physical therapy, after a training accident had left her with a spinal compression that the surgeons described as manageable, and which she experienced as a white spike of pain every time she shifted her weight. She was 29 years old. She had been a combat systems technician with the 4th Rapid Response Brigade. She had a memory card. Everyone had one now. It was standard issue, refined chipped, loaded at birth with the running total of everything you were. And she had absolutely no money for a frame, which started at a price point roughly equivalent to a 3-bedroom apartment in a major European city and scaled up from there. She watched the news feeds from her cot. She watched the line get longer. She watched the emerge from the licensing offices, looking subtly different, smoother somehow, the way a stone looks different after the river has worked on it for a season. She watched the protests, small at first and then not small. She watched the counter-protests. She watched 3 different governments negotiate exclusive frame distribution deals with the Veth, and then watched 2 of those governments fall within 18 months. What Dara did not watch, because she was busy being a person trying to keep her own original flesh and bone body functional, was the slow grinding machinery of what happened to the people who had signed frame leases, and then could not make the payments. She found out the hard way 2 years later, in a processing center outside Marseille, when she was brought in as a security contractor to help with what the Veth liaison officer described as a routine repossession action. The center looked like a hospital from the outside. Long, white corridors, soft lighting, staff in pale gray uniforms who moved with the liquid efficiency of people who had very good frames and were being paid well to wear them. Dara and her team were stationed near the back, near what the floor plan labeled as the transition suites. And she did not understand what she was looking at until the first client. That was the word the gray uniformed staff used. Client was brought through the corridor. He was a man in his 40s, or his frame was. You couldn't tell anymore what age meant when the chassis was leased. He was walking without being helped, which she'd been told was standard. They could walk themselves to the suite. It wasn't violent. He was carrying a small bag. When he passed Dara, he glanced at her sidelong, and she saw something in his eyes that she had seen in her own eyes once in the hospital mirror in Lyon. The look of a person making an inventory of what they still had left. Inside the suite, a technician would extract the memory card. The frame would be powered down and returned to the Veth's maintenance pool for refurbishment and reissue. The client would emerge on the other side in whatever biological body the Veth's welfare protocol provided. Basic, minimal, the cheapest substrate they were obligated to supply under the humanitarian addendum of the frame accord. What Dara had not been told, because it was in paragraph 47 of a contract addendum she had not read, was that the humanitarian welfare body was not the client's original body. The VETH had repurposed those, recycled technically. The biological material had been redirected into new frame substrates years ago. The welfare body was a generic chassis, grown to population average specifications, with no particular relationship to the face the person had been born with. The man with the bag came out of the suite 11 minutes later in a body that was not his. It was fine. It was a functional human body. He could walk in it and see from it and breathe with it. But his hands were different, broader, darker at the knuckle, the nails shaped differently than what he'd had going in. He stood in the corridor and looked at his hands for a long time before anyone spoke to him. Dara asked for reassignment that evening. She was told it was not available. She completed the contract. She did not sleep much. She started reading the frame accord from the beginning. There were, she discovered over the following months, two parallel worlds developing under the VETH's stewardship of human embodiment. There was the world of people who could afford to keep paying, the frame holders, the subscribers, who moved through cities with a particular ease, recognizable by their posture if not by their faces, which could be anything on a given day. And there was the other world. The people who had signed leases they couldn't sustain. The people who had never had the money in the first place, but whose governments had subsidized entry-level frames as a political gesture and then cut the subsidies. The people whose employers had made frame adoption a condition of certain jobs. The people in the welfare bodies standing in corridors looking at hands that were not theirs. It was the memory cards that mattered, Dara kept thinking. Everything that was actually you, the accumulated weight of a life, the memories, the patterns of thought, the residue of grief and humor and specific knowledge of how your mother took her tea. All of that was on a card the size of a thumbnail. The VETH had not invented the cards, humans had. It was one of the stranger cultural negotiations of the contact period. The fact that humanity had been moving toward external memory storage independently, and the VETH had arrived to find a species already halfway to the technology that made frame adoption possible. The cards were human, the rest was VETH. She got the assignment she needed, 8 months after the Marseille repossession, through a chain of favors and deliberate quiet competence that was entirely characteristic of how Dara Osi moved through the world. She was attached to a research liaison team embedded with the VETH's own technical division, officially as a security escort actually, because she was good with systems and had made sure the right people knew it, as someone who could read the VETH technical documentation that had been incompletely translated and flag the gaps. The VETH Technical Division was located in what had been the industrial district of a mid-sized German city, in a building that from the outside looked like every other building in that city, and from the inside looked like nothing else on the planet. The walls were grown, not built. The surfaces absorbed sound in a way that made Dara feel perpetually, slightly muffled. The VETH who worked there were 6 of them, which was unusual. Most VETH interactions with humans involved 1 or 2 individuals, were tall and sectioned in a way that was hard to look at directly, like a visual trick that only worked from certain angles. The lead VETH on the research liaison team was designated, in the translation software, as Coordinator 7. Dara called it 7 in her head because it was easier, and because she had a tendency to give things compact names. 7 communicated via a speaker device that converted its resonant click speech into synthesized human language, and it was very, very good at appearing to understand human emotional register while giving no actual ground on anything substantive. Dara had spent a week reading the translated documentation before she found the first gap. It was in the maintenance protocols for the memory card interface, the slot at the base of the skull, the junction point between the card and the frame's synthetic neural substrate. The translation described the interface as a passive receptor with no active processing function. Dara had looked at the electrical diagrams for 20 minutes, and then, very quietly gone back to her bunk and sat with what she now knew for a while before she wrote it down. The interface was not passive, it was reading the cards, not retrieving memory. The frame didn't need to access memory to function. It was indexing, building a profile. Every card slotted into a frame was being scanned in a way that the card's original human-designed architecture did not account for and could not detect. The VETH were currently reading every human memory card that had ever been inserted into a frame. 200 million cards at current adoption figures. 200 million complete human psychographic profiles. accumulated over 7 years of frame deployment, stored somewhere in the Veth's data architecture. Dara sat on her bunk for a while longer. Then she went and found the secondary documentation, the parts that had not been translated at all yet, and spent 3 days with a dictionary program and a great deal of patience building her own rough translation. What she found in the secondary documentation was not a weapon, it was not a directive. It was something that took her longer to understand than anything else she had ever tried to understand, because it required her to shift her entire frame of reference about what the Veth's goals actually were. The Veth were not, as humanity had assumed, simply a more advanced civilization sharing technology for profit. They were a civilization in a specific kind of crisis. 200 years of frame adoption had done something to their own memory cards. The long-term effect of repeated transfers between biological and synthetic substrates had introduced a kind of degradation that affected emotional processing. The Veth frames worked perfectly. The Veth themselves, the actual individuals behind the cards, had been losing something for generations. The resonant click language, the way they communicated in tones that required sustained attention to follow, the extreme precision of their contractual language, all of it was, as best Dara could translate, compensation. Scaffolding built around a growing absence. They needed the human psychographic data not to exploit it. They needed it to understand what they had lost. They were looking in 200 million human memories for the thing they had forgotten how to have. Dara sat with this for a long time. Then she went and found Sergeant Felix Marchetti, who was the other half of the security escort, and who she had been talking to every evening for 3 months about things that mattered and things that didn't. And she told him what she'd found. She didn't lead with the conclusion. She walked him through the diagrams first, the way she'd want someone to do for her, so that he arrived at the understanding himself, rather than being handed it. He was quiet for a while after. Then he said, "So what do we do?" She had been thinking about this. "We don't leak it," she said. "Not yet. Leaking it right now just causes panic and gives the Veth a reason to lock everything down and accelerate." She paused. "We need to find the index." The index was the database, the compiled psychographic profiles. If they could locate it, not just confirm its existence, but actually find the architecture, the access points, the structure, then they had something. A specific, documented thing they could use in a negotiation that was currently happening entirely on the Veth's terms. Marchetti asked how they were supposed to find in a building full of systems they didn't have access to, and beings who were fundamentally hard to read. Dara said, "The same way you find anything. You watch what they're protective of." She was careful about it. She was not, by temperament, a person who was careless about anything. But she was especially careful about this because she understood that being caught doing what she was doing would not result in anything good, and also because she was genuinely not sure yet what the right thing to do with the information was. And she wanted the option to decide slowly. What she was protective of in return was the memory card clipped to the inside of her left breast pocket. She touched it sometimes without meaning to. A reflex, the way you'd touch a scar. It held 32 years of her life. It held her mother's voice, her training scores, the specific quality of afternoon light in the apartment where she'd grown up, the weight of grief after her brother's accident, the first time she'd understood a technical system well enough to fix it by feel. It held who she was. She thought about the man with the bag standing in the corridor looking at his hands. She watched Seven for 11 days. She cataloged the parts of the building where Seven's movement patterns changed. Small changes, barely perceptible if you weren't looking for them. A slight adjustment in posture when passing certain corridors. A consistency in where Seven stood during team briefings that had nothing to do with sightlines. She cross-referenced with the building schematics she'd been given legitimate access to, and mapped the location she hadn't. On the 12th day, she told Marchetti she needed 4 hours, and asked him to cover for her in a way that did not require him to lie, just to not be asked certain questions. He looked at her for a moment. "You're going to do something that can't be undone, aren't you?" She thought about it honestly. "I'm going to find something," she said. "What I do with it after is still undecided." The corridor she needed was on the 3rd sublevel. She had worked out a route that kept her within the areas she had legitimate reasons to be in until the last 40 meters. The Veth's internal security was good, but it was designed around Veth-scale threats. It did not account particularly well for a human who was willing to move slowly, who understood electrical systems well enough to read the patrol logic from the sensor placement, and who had made a point over 3 months of being unremarkable. The server room, if server room was the right word for it. The walls were grown here too, and the storage architecture was partially biological, tissue-thin membranes of the frame substrate material, arrayed in columns that hummed at a frequency she felt in her molars, was cold and blue-lit, and larger than the building's external dimensions suggested it should be. She stood in the entrance for a moment and let her eyes adjust. 200 million people, she thought. All of them in here. She did not have time to do what she had initially thought she needed to do, which was navigate the architecture and extract a meaningful sample. What she had time to do was the thing she had actually come to do, which was document. She had a small recording device, civilian model, nothing that would trip a military tech sensor, and she spent 40 minutes building a systematic visual and audio record of the room. The hum, the membrane columns, the access terminal she did not touch, the labeling system in VithScript that she photographed carefully for later translation work. The scale of it. She left the room exactly as she'd found it, and walked back through the building at the same careful pace she'd come in. Marchetti was in the corridor outside their briefing room when she came back up. He looked at her face and said nothing, which was one of the things she valued about him. What she had recorded was not by itself actionable intelligence in the traditional sense, but it was evidence, documented, time-stamped, authenticated evidence that the index existed, that it was physical infrastructure located in a specific building in a specific city, and that its scale matched the scale implied by the documentation she'd found. It was the difference between a suspicion and a fact with coordinates. She spent 2 days writing the report. Not a leak. A formal submission through the military liaison channel to the Frame Accord Oversight Committee, the multilateral body that existed, technically, to monitor compliance with the Frame Accord's humanitarian provisions. The committee had been largely ineffectual since its founding because it had never had anything concrete to work with. No one had ever given it a primary source. She sent the report on a Friday evening. She filed a copy with the Independent Scientific Registry in Geneva, using a protocol designed for exactly this kind of submission. Evidence of potential accord violations requiring independent technical verification. She sent a third copy to a journalist she had identified over several months as someone who understood technical documentation and was not going to misrepresent it. Then she went and found Marchetti and told him what she'd done. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The Veth are going to know it was you. Yes, they'll pull the liaison contract. You'll be reassigned or terminated. Probably." She touched the card in her pocket reflex. "That's okay." He looked at her for a while. There was something in his expression that she recognized. Not pity, not alarm, something quieter. The look of a person who has just watched someone do a thing that needed to be done and was going to cost the person doing it. "What happens now?" he asked. "The committee gets a fact instead of a suspicion," she said. "The scientific registry has an authenticated primary source. The journalist has a story that's actually a story." She paused. "The Veth will deny it for a while. Then they'll have to account for it. And the accounting will take a long time and probably won't go perfectly, but it'll be real, because the documentation is real." She shifted her weight. Her spine hurt the way it always hurt. What happens now is the same thing that always happens. People argue about it for years. Some of it gets fixed. Some of it doesn't. "That's not very HFY of you," he said, which was a phrase she'd heard a few times from civilians who'd been following the contact forums online. The idea that humanity's response to alien contact should be triumphant, definitive, a single clean victory. She thought about the man with the bag, the hands that weren't his, the 200 million cards in the cold blue room. She thought about the Veth's degraded emotional processing, the generations of absence, the fact that they had been reading human memories, looking for something they had lost the name for. "We don't need to beat them," she said. "They're not winning either. They've just been losing longer." Marchetti thought about this. "So what did we actually do?" "We made it harder to ignore." She looked at the corridor wall, at the grown surface of it, the slight organic texture. "That's the thing about facts with coordinates. You can't put them back where you found them." The committee opened a formal inquiry 6 weeks later. It was the first time in the history of the Frame Accord oversight structure that an inquiry had been opened based on physical evidence rather than complaints. The Veth delegation requested 3 adjournments. They were granted 2. The third was denied by a vote of 7-2, with the deciding votes cast by representatives from the nations with the highest concentration of welfare body recipients, which was not a coincidence. The report had moved, as Dara had known it would, From the committee to the press to the constituency offices of people who had been trying to explain to their governments for years that something was wrong in the processing centers. Dara was not at the inquiry. She was in a physical clinic in Toulouse. Because the spine compression had progressed in the months of extended stress, and she had finally agreed to a surgical intervention she had been deferring. The surgery was good. Not a frame, she had been offered frame assistance and declined, for reasons that were not ideological so much as specific, having to do with the card in her pocket and what she knew was on it. Marchetti came to see her 3 days after the surgery, when she was sitting up in the recovery bed, and could handle company. He brought coffee from the place down the street that she'd mentioned once in passing, which meant he'd paid attention. She noted this without comment. He told her about the inquiry developments. She listened. There were VETH representatives on the committee now, a concession extracted early in the process, which meant the conversations were slower and more contested, and, for the first time, real. Both sides arguing from the same documented facts instead of parallel narratives. They're going to offer a data return protocol, Marchetti said. The profiles. Structured access for the individuals whose cards were indexed. She hadn't known that was coming. She let it sit. They'll fight about the implementation for 2 years at least, he said. Probably 3. And the welfare body situation? Longer. She shifted in the bed, felt the improved mobility in her lower back with a cautious, almost experimental attention. But it's in the record now. You can't undocument something. She picked up the coffee. It was the right temperature, which was a small, perfect thing. The argument about what to do with a fact is still a better argument than the one about whether the fact exists. He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was working towards something. She waited. Your card, he said finally. She looked at him. It was indexed. If they build the return protocol, I know. Do you want to know what they found in the profile? What they were looking for in all of them. She thought about the VETH secondary documentation, the absence, the thing they had lost the name for. She thought about what 200 million human lives, in aggregate, the full weight of fear and stubbornness and humor and grief, and the particular texture of specific late afternoons. What all of that might look like to a species that had been without it for generations. What word they might have found for it in the index. I already know, she said. He waited. It's the same thing that's on every card, she said. The thing you can't upgrade and can't lease and can't reclaim once you've repossessed it often enough. She held the coffee in both hands and felt the warmth of it. It's just being here, in a body, in a specific moment, knowing it won't last. He looked at her for a moment, then he looked at his own hands, a gesture she suspected neither of them would ever be entirely free of. Now, the VETH don't have that, he said. No, and we won't give it to them. She considered this with the care it deserved. We won't sell it to them, she said. That's not the same thing. She looked at the window, at the afternoon light coming in from the street, the specific quality of it, the way it was only ever exactly this light, on exactly this afternoon, and then was something else. Understanding each other, that part we can actually do, if we're careful about the terms. The inquiry ran for 4 years. The welfare body provisions were revised in year 2, under pressure from 14 governments, and 3 separate independent technical commissions that had built on Dara's primary source documentation. The data return protocol was implemented in a limited form in year 3, contested, revised, contested again, and finally settled into something that was imperfect and real and subject to further revision, which was, as Dara noted in the 1/6 statement she gave on the subject, the most honest thing either species had managed to build together. She was in Toulouse when the statement came out. She was working as a technical consultant for the Oversight Committee, which had acquired genuine teeth since the inquiry, and which paid modestly but sufficiently. Her spine was manageable. She still touched the card in her pocket sometimes. Reflex, the way you'd touch something you needed to know, was still there. She did not own a frame. She had been asked periodically, by people who thought they were being kind, whether she intended to get one once the lease terms were reformed. Her answer was always the same. She was fine, she would say. She was in her own body in her specific moment, knowing it would not last. She was fine. In the cold blue room on the 3rd sublevel of the building in Germany, the hum of 200 million human lives was quieter now. Some of the membrane columns had been deactivated pending the return protocol implementation. The room was still enormous. The access terminal was now jointly monitored by a human VETH technical panel. 7 was still there, on the liaison team. It had not, as far as Dara could determine, changed appreciably. Its posture still adjusted slightly in certain corridors. Its synthesized voice still carried the precise architectural quality of something being very carefully constructed. But once, only once, in a corridor outside the briefing room, on a morning when the light was coming in at a specific angle through the building's upper windows, and the air had that particular quality, it sometimes got in late autumn not quite cold, not quite warm. Seven had paused next to her without particular reason, and had been silent in a way that was different from its usual efficient silence. Dara had not said anything either. After a moment, Seven had moved on. She did not know what it had been doing. She suspected it did not have precise words for it either. She thought it might have been in its ways, standing in the light. She had let it. That was the thing about being human that no contract had ever found a way to price. You could afford to let something just be what it was for a moment, without owning it, without leasing it, without needing to extract a return. You could afford to stand in the light and let another creature stand in it too. It cost you nothing. It was worth everything.